The dust of Providence Gulch settled on everything, a fine, gritty powder that clung to sorrow and sweat in equal measure. It coated the hem of Alara's worn calico dress, filmed the window of the small cabin her husband had built before the fever took him, and settled in the lines of worry around her tired eyes. At 26, she felt ancient. The life swelling within her was a constant, heavy reminder of all she had lost and all she now stood to lose alone. Her daily walk was a short, grim pilgrimage for her cabin at the barren edge of town to the general store and back. It was a route that took her past the town's most prominent and least hopeful structure, the squat stone jailhouse. Inside its single, barred window, a man sat in the shadows. She didn't know his name or his crime, only that he'd been there for 3 weeks, a piece of human refuse left to bake in the oppressive summer heat. The town's sheriff, a beefy, cruel man named Barlow, seemed to take a particular pleasure in the prisoner's slow decay, often remarking in the saloon how the man was too stubborn to break. Alara had heard the whispers. He was a drifter, a horse thief, a murderer. The stories changed with each telling, growing more lurid and monstrous. The women of the town clutched their children closer when they passed the jail. The men spat tobacco juice in its direction. He was an outcast, a designated vessel for all the fear and hatred that festered in a town clinging to survival by its fingernails. But Alara saw something else. She saw a profound and terrible loneliness that mirrored her own. While the town shunned him, she felt an unwilling kinship. Her own isolation was a prison of grief and impending motherhood. His was one of stone and iron. Both, she suspected, were sentences handed down without a fair trial. Today, the heat was a physical weight. The air was thick and still, promising a thunderstorm that refused to break. Inside her cabin, the air was stifling, but the scent of baking cornbread offered a small, buttery comfort. She'd made it from the last of her cornmeal, a small indulgence she couldn't really afford. As she sliced into the golden slab, a thought, sharp and insistent, pierced through her lethargy. He would be hungry. It was a foolish, dangerous idea. Barlow watched the jail like a hawk. The townspeople would surely see it as a sign of a loose mind or looser morals. A pregnant widow consorting with a caged animal. The gossip would be merciless. She hesitated, her hand trembling slightly as it held the knife. Her husband, Thomas, had been a good man, a kind man. He would have shared his last crust. The thought of him, of his quiet decency, solidified her resolve. She wrapped a thick wedge of the warm cornbread in a clean rag, her heart thumping a nervous rhythm against her ribs. Placing in her basket, she covered it with a few meager purchases she'd pretended to need from the store. With her shawl pulled tight despite the heat, she stepped outside, her gaze fixed on the jailhouse down the path. She didn't know his crime, only his hunger. And with a simple piece of cornbread, she sealed her fate to his. There's more to this prisoner than meets the eye. Before their true worth or secret comes to light, tell us, have you ever misjudged someone only to be surprised? And if you love a story of hidden depths, hit like and subscribe. The journey, no more than 200 yards, felt like a mile. Every window seemed to hold a pair of watching eyes. Every creak of a porch rocker sounded like a judgment. Sheriff Barlow was nowhere to be seen, likely nursing a whiskey in the shade of the saloon's awning. A small mercy. Alara's steps quickened as she approached the jail, her breath catching in her throat. The barred window was low, set deep into the stone. As she drew near, a shape shifted in the darkness within. A face appeared, gaunt and shadowed, etched with lines of grime and exhaustion. A pair of eyes, startlingly clear and intelligent, met hers. They held no malice, only a deep, weary caution. Her courage faltered. This was madness. She was a lone woman, vulnerable in every way imaginable. He was a prisoner, a man the world had condemned. But then his gaze dropped to the slight swell of her belly, and the hardness in his eyes softened for a fraction of a second, replaced by something that looked almost like understanding. Without a word, her hands shaking, she reached into her basket and pulled out the rag-wrapped bundle. She stretched her arm, pushing the cornbread through the gap between two iron bars. It was a clumsy, desperate gesture. The man didn't move. He simply watched her, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, the only sound was the buzzing of flies and the distant clang of the blacksmith's hammer. Alara felt a flush of shame and fear creep up her neck. He would refuse it. He would laugh at her. Then, slowly, a hand emerged from the shadows. It was caked with dirt, the knuckles bruised, but the movement was deliberate. His fingers brushed hers as he took the bundle, a touch so light it was like the whisper of a moth's wing. It sent a strange jolt through her, a current of shared humanity that defied the iron bars between them. He retreated into the gloom. She heard the soft unfolding of the rag. Silence. She didn't wait for a thank you. She didn't know what she had been expecting. Turning quickly, she pulled her shawl tighter and walked back to her cabin, her legs unsteady. She didn't look back, but she could feel his eyes on her, a silent, weighty presence that followed her all the way home. Inside her cabin, with the door bolted, she leaned against the rough wood, her heart still racing. She had crossed a line, not just with the town, but within herself. She had acted not out of prudence or fear, but out of a simple, unadorned compassion. And in the suffocating loneliness of Providence Gulch, it felt like the most radical act she had ever committed. That night, the storm finally broke. Thunder rattled the window panes, and lightning bleached the landscape in stark, momentary flashes. Alara lay awake, one hand resting on her belly, listening to the rain hammer against the roof. With each crash of thunder, she thought of the man in the stone cell, wondering if the rain found its way through the cracks, if the noise frightened him, or if it was a comfort, washing the world clean for a little while. The next day, she did it again. This time, it was a small cup of broth, saved from the stringy chicken she'd boiled for her supper. She carried it with more confidence, her fear from the day before having settled into a quiet resolve. When she reached the window, he was already there, waiting. He took the cup with that same deliberate grace, his fingers carefully avoiding hers. He drank it slowly, his eyes closed for a moment as if savoring the warmth. When he handed the tin cup back, his voice, a low, rough rasp from disuse, startled her. "Jedediah," he said, just the one word. "Alara," she replied, her own voice barely a whisper. It was an introduction, an acknowledgement, a thread of connection spun in the space of a breath. Their strange ritual continued for a week. A boiled potato, half an apple, another piece of cornbread. They rarely spoke more than each other's names. The exchanges were brief, furtive, cloaked in the shadows of early morning or late afternoon when the streets were quietest. Yet in those silent moments a fragile understanding grew. She saw in his posture not the slump of a defeated criminal, but the coiled stillness of a man biding his time. He saw in her not a foolish, pitying woman, but a bastion of defiant kindness in a world that had offered him none. He learned the rhythm of her life through the sounds that carried from her cabin, the chop of an axe on wood, the soft lull of her humming a nameless tune. She learned the depth of his isolation by the profound silence that emanated from his cell, a silence that seemed to swallow all hope. The town, of course, noticed. Providence Gulch was a place where secrets had the life expectancy of a snowflake on a hot stove. Whispers followed Alara like her own shadow. Old Man Hemlock at the general store started giving her the sourest look when she bought her flour. Martha Gable, the pastor's wife, crossed the street with a sniff to avoid passing too close. The confrontation she'd been dreading came on a Tuesday. She was returning from the jail, her empty basket on her arm, when Sheriff Barlow stepped out from between the general store and the assayer's office. He blocked her path, a mountain of sweat-stained flannel and sour whiskey breath. His small, piggy eyes raked over her, lingering on her pregnant form with a leering familiarity that made her skin crawl. "Playing nursemaid to my prisoner, are we, widow?" he sneered, his voice a low growl. A couple of his cronies, loafers who spent their days propping up the saloon walls, chuckled behind him. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs, but she met his gaze, lifting her chin. "I don't know what you mean, Sheriff." "Don't you?" He took a step closer, invading her space. The smell of him was overwhelming. "I see you," scurrying back and forth to that cell like a mouse feeding a snake. "You got a soft spot for killers, Alara? Or are you just lonely?" The insult, so crude and public, struck her like a slap. Heat flooded her cheeks. "He was hungry," she said, her voice tight. "He's a murderer. He's supposed to be hungry," Barlow spat. "Whatever sentimental nonsense you've got in your head, you get it out. The man in that cell is my property until the circuit judge gets here. You stay away from him. You understand me?" From the jailhouse window, Jedediah heard every word. He was pressed against the cold stone, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles were white. The impotent rage that surged through him was a physical poison, burning in his gut. He could hear the tremor of fear in her voice and the vile slick of threat in Barlow's. He had faced down men with guns, stared into the eyes of true evil. But this feeling of being caged and helpless while the only person who had shown him a shred of decency was being tormented on his behalf was the cruelest torture he had ever endured. He slammed his fist into the stone wall, the sharp pain a welcome distraction from the fury. He owed her more than a piece of cornbread. Alara didn't answer Barlow. She simply stared at him, her fear warring with a cold, rising anger. Finally, she stepped around him, her back straight, and walked away without another word. His laughter followed her, a coarse, ugly sound that echoed the town's silent condemnation. That night, she didn't sleep at all. The sheriff's threat hung in the air of her small cabin, a promise of more trouble to come. She felt more alone than ever. The small, secret connection she'd forged with the prisoner now felt like a terrible liability. She had invited the town's ugliness to her doorstep. Just before midnight, the oppressive silence of the town was shattered. It started with a single, sharp crack of a gunshot from the direction of the saloon. It was followed by a panicked shout, then another shot, closer this time. Door slammed. A woman screamed. Alara scrambled from her bed, her heart pounding with a fresh, immediate terror. She rushed to the window, peering through a crack in the curtains. Men were running in the street, their forms illuminated by the light spilling from the saloon doors. They were shouting Barlow's name. The chaos lasted for nearly an hour. Finally, a tense, watchful quiet fell over Providence Gulch, heavier and more menacing than the silence that had preceded it. Alara stayed at her window, waiting for a dawn she now dreaded. As the first pale, gray light of morning began to silhouette the rooftops, she saw a small group of men emerge from the doctor's office. They were the town council, Hemlock the store owner, Miller the blacksmith, and old Pastor Gable. They walked with a grim, determined purpose, not toward the saloon, but toward the jailhouse. Alara watched, her blood running cold, as Miller used a heavy key to unlock the cell door. A moment later, Jedediah stepped out into the morning light. He was blinking, his face pale beneath the grime, but he stood tall. He was no longer a prisoner. The councilmen were talking to him, their gestures sharp and urgent. Then, in a movement that made Alara gasp, Miller unpinned the tin star from his own vest. He was the town's part-time deputy, and pinned it onto Jedediah's dusty shirt. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The prisoner, the outcast, the man she had been feeding scraps to in secret, was now the law. Sheriff Jedediah stood for a moment, the morning sun glinting off the newly acquired star on his chest. The weight of it was both foreign and familiar. The councilmen were still talking, a nervous clatter of words about Barlow being found shot dead behind the saloon, about Silas Croft, the wealthy rancher who owned the town lock, stock, and barrel, and how he'd be furious. They spoke of the need for order, for a man who wasn't in Croft's pocket to hold the town together until the circuit judge arrived. They had made a desperate gamble, appointing a stranger with a questionable past, because his very obscurity made him the only man they could be sure wasn't already bought and paid for. Jedediah listened with half an ear. His gaze, however, swept past them, over the dusty main street, and settled on the small, solitary cabin at the edge of town. He saw the flicker of a curtain in the window and knew she was watching. The chaos of the night, Barlow's death, the shocking turn of his own fortune. all of it receded into the background. His first duty was not to the nervous men beside him or to the town that had scorned him. It was to the woman who had shared her cornbread. Ignoring the council's sputtering questions, he began to walk. His stride was long and purposeful, eating up the distance to her cabin. The few townspeople who had ventured out onto their porches stared in stunned silence. The prisoner, now the sheriff, was making his first official active visit to the pregnant widow who had befriended him. The gossip was already taking flight, but for the first time, Jedediah was in a position to ignore it. Alara saw him coming, and her heart seized. She backed away from the window, her mind reeling. The sheriff? How? Why? Fear, sharp and cold, washed over her. Barlow had been a monster, but he was a known monster. This was something else entirely. She had shown kindness to a man in a cage. What kind of man was he now that the cage was gone? A firm knock echoed on her door. It wasn't the arrogant rap of Barlow, but a solid, respectful sound. She hesitated, her hand pressed to her chest, trying to still its frantic beating. Alara. His voice came through the door, still rough but steady. It's Jedediah. Please, I need to talk to you. Taking a deep, shaky breath, she unbolted the door and opened it a crack. He stood on her stoop, the morning light behind him making a silhouette of his broad shoulders. He had taken a moment to wash his face at the town pump. The grime was gone, revealing strong, angular features and a jaw tight with resolve. The weariness was still in his eyes, but it was now overlaid with a formidable authority. The tin star on his chest seemed to burn with a light of its own. "May I come in?" he asked quietly. She nodded, stepping back to let him pass. He filled her small cabin, his presence immense in the confined space. He took off his hat, holding it respectfully in his hands. The silence between them was thick with unspoken questions. "Barlow is dead," he said, getting straight to the point. "Someone shot him in the back. The council thinks it was one of Silas Croft's men getting rid of a liability." Silas Croft. The name was a chill down Alara's spine. Croft owned the largest ranch in the valley, held the mortgage on half the businesses in town, and operated with the casual cruelty of a king. Barlow had been his dog. They needed a Sheriff Croft didn't own. Jedediah continued, his eyes meeting hers. "Someone told them I used to be a ranger down in Texas. So they made me an offer. The star for the truth about why I was really in that cell." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "I wasn't a horse thief, Alara, or a murderer. I was a drifter passing through. I saw two of Croft's men rustling cattle from a small homesteader a few miles east of here. Before I could report it, they cornered me, and Barlow threw me in jail on a false charge to keep me quiet until the judge came through. They were planning on me disappearing on the trail out of town." It all clicked into place. The cruelty, the isolation, the determination to keep him hidden away. He was a witness, a dangerous loose end. "You believe me?" he asked, his voice low. Alara looked at him, truly looked at him, for the first time without bars between them. She saw the honesty in his clear eyes, the rigid set of his shoulders that spoke of a man of principle pushed to his limit. She remembered the quiet dignity with which he'd accepted her meager offerings. "Yes," she breathed. "I believe you." A flicker of relief crossed his face. "Thank you. That means more than you know." He took a step closer, his gaze softening as he looked at her. "I heard what Barlow said to you yesterday. I was unable to intervene. I won't be unable again. Croft will not take kindly to my new position. He'll see it as a threat, and he'll come for me. And when he does, he might try to use you to get to me. Because this whole town saw you show me kindness." The implication hung in the air between them. Her act of compassion had marked her, made her a target. "I'm telling you this," Jedediah said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "because I want you to know you have my protection. For what it's worth, I will not let him or anyone else in this town harm you. I swear it." He wasn't just a sheriff making a promise to a citizen. He was a man repaying a debt of honor, a debt that had begun with a piece of warm cornbread. Alara felt a wave of emotion so strong it made her dizzy. Fear for what was to come, but also a profound, startling sense of safety she hadn't felt since her husband died. For the first time in months, she was not entirely alone. "What will you do?" she asked. "My job," he said simply. "Uphold the law. Even if Silas Croft thinks he owns it." His gaze drifted around her small, sparse cabin, a home that was clean and cared for despite the poverty. "But first, I need you to promise me something. Stay inside. Keep your door bolted. Don't go out unless you have to. Croft is a snake, and I don't know where he'll strike first." She nodded, understanding the gravity of his warning. The town of Providence Gulch was a powder keg, and the council had just handed the match to the one man brave enough, or foolish enough, to light it. And she, Alara, was standing right beside him. The fragile peace of her lonely existence was over. A war was coming to her doorstep. The day passed in a state of suspended animation. Providence Gulch held its breath. The saloon was eerily quiet. Men spoke in hushed tones on street corners, their eyes constantly scanning the road that led to the Croft Ranch. Jedediah spent the day establishing his presence. He wasn't loud or aggressive like Barlow had been. Instead, he moved with a quiet, observant authority that was far more unsettling to the town's darker elements. He spoke with Hemlock at the store, inspected the lockup at the jail, and spent a long time at the blacksmith's, watching Miller shoe a horse, their conversation low and serious. He was building alliances, shoring up his defenses. Every move he made was deliberate, a clear signal that the town was no longer a lawless playground for the powerful. He was a chess player arranging his pieces, and everyone knew Silas Croft's move was coming. From her window, Alara watched it all. She saw the subtle shifts in the town's atmosphere. The fear was still there, but it was now mingled with a spark of something else. Hope. The way Jedediah walked, the way he met a man's eye without flinching, it inspired a courage the town had long forgotten it possessed. Late in the afternoon, a rider galloped into town from the east. It was one of Croft's men, a surly hand named Taggart. He didn't stop at the saloon, but rode directly to the sheriff's office, which was attached to the jailhouse. He dismounted, his spurs jingling with aggressive intent, and disappeared inside. Alara's hands grew cold. This was it, the opening salvo. Minutes later, Taggart stormed back out, his face a mask of thunderous rage. He threw himself onto his horse and galloped back out of town, kicking up a storm of dust. A tense silence fell in his wake. Jedediah appeared in the doorway of his office. He stood there for a long moment, watching the dust settle, his expression grim. Then, he turned and his eyes found her window, as if he knew she'd be watching. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. It was a reassurance, a silent message. The first test is passed. Be ready for the next. That night, Alara baked another batch of cornbread. The familiar, comforting scent filled her cabin, a small act of normalcy in a world turned upside down. As she worked, she thought about the man who now wore the town star. He was facing down a tyrant, not for ambition or for pay, but because it was the right thing to do. He was protecting her, and in doing so, he was protecting the very idea of decency in this harsh, unforgiving place. There was a knock on the door, the same solid, respectful knock from the morning. She opened it to find him standing there, his face etched with the weariness of the long day. "I saw your lamp was lit," he said. "Just wanted to make sure you were all right." "I am," she said, her voice soft. She held up the pan of cornbread. "I made this. I thought you might be hungry." A slow smile spread across his face, reaching his eyes and transforming his stern features. It was the first time she had ever seen him smile. It was like watching the sun break through storm clouds. "Alara," he said, his voice filled with a warmth that had nothing to do with the night air. "I believe I am." He stepped inside, and she cut him a large piece. They sat in silence at her small table, the lamp casting a warm glow around them. He ate the cornbread with a slow, deliberate appreciation, as if it were the finest meal he'd ever had. In the quiet of the cabin, with the thread of Silas Croft looming over them, this shared, simple meal felt like an act of defiance. It was a statement that even in the face of fear, there was still room for kindness, for connection, for a moment of peace. He finished the last crumb and looked at her, his expression serious once more. Croft sent Taggart to deliver a message. He said the town made a mistake, that a jailbird can't be a lawman, and he's coming tomorrow to correct that mistake. He's bringing 12 men with him. 12 men. Against one. Alara's blood ran cold. What are you going to do? My job, he said again, but this time his eyes held hers with a new intensity. I'm not asking you to be involved. In the morning, I want you to go to Pastor Gable's house. His wife will look after you. You'll be safe there, away from the main street. She looked at him, at the set of his jaw, at the resolve in his eyes. He was planning to face them alone. He was willing to die to protect her and the town. A fierce, protective instinct, one she hadn't felt since she'd lost her husband, rose up inside her. No, she said, her voice surprisingly firm. Jedediah looked taken aback. Alara, this is my home, she said, one hand unconsciously going to her belly. You're doing this because of what I did, because I showed you kindness. I won't hide while you face him for it. I won't run. He stared at her, a complex mix of admiration and frustration in his eyes. You are the most stubborn woman I have ever met. Then you should be glad I'm on your side, she retorted, a flicker of her own smile gracing her lips. He stood up, his tall frame seeming to fill the small room with a sense of unbreakable strength. He placed his hand over hers where it rested on the table. His touch was warm and firm, a silent acknowledgement of their unlikely alliance. Get some rest, Alara, he said softly. Tomorrow is going to be a long day. He left, closing the door quietly behind him. Alara sat at the table for a long time, his warmth still lingering on her hand. She was afraid, more afraid than she had ever been in her life. But for the first time, she was not afraid of being alone. She was part of something bigger now. She was a partner in a stand against the darkness, and she would not falter. The pregnant widow and the jailbird sheriff, they would face the dawn and whatever it brought together. The morning arrived not with a bang, but with a terrible, creeping stillness. The sun rose into a hazy, white sky, bleaching the color from the dusty street. Businesses did not open. Doors remained shut and bolted. The only sounds were the cawing of a distant crow and the anxious whine of a dog somewhere. It was a town holding its breath, waiting for the storm. Jedediah stood in the middle of the main street, directly in front of his office. He had cleaned his Colt, its metal gleaming in the pale light. His face was a stoic mask, but his eyes were alive, constantly scanning, missing nothing. He looked solid, immovable, a lone rock against which the tide was about to break. From her window, Alara watched him. She had not gone to the pastor's house. Her door was bolted, but she had not hidden herself away. She had a pot of coffee brewing on the stove, a simple domestic act of faith that there would be an after her presence in that cabin. So close to the center of the impending conflict was a silent declaration. She was not a damsel to be sheltered. She was his ally. He knew she was there, and he drew a quiet strength from it. At a little past 9, they appeared, a cloud of dust on the eastern road, resolving itself into 12 riders. They moved not with the urgency of an attack, but with the slow, arrogant swagger of men who believe they own the ground beneath their horses' hooves. At their head was Silas Croft, a man in his 50s with a prosperous gut, a face hardened by greed, and eyes as cold and flat as river stones. They rode into town and fanned out, forming a loose, intimidating semicircle around Jedediah. The jingle of their harnesses and the creak of saddle leather were unnaturally loud in the silence. Croft reined in his horse 12 feet from the lone sheriff. Well, well, Croft said, his voice carrying an oily amusement. Look what the council dragged out of the muck. A tin star doesn't change what you are, boy. You're a common thief. This town doesn't need your kind of law. Jedediah didn't rise to the bait. His voice was calm, steady, and loud enough for every hidden ear to hear. The council appointed me, Croft. I'm the law here, and my first act is to inform you that there's a warrant out for 2 of your men, Taggart and Jones, for cattle rustling, and 1 for you, for conspiracy to conceal a crime and threatening a federal witness. A murmur went through Croft's men. Croft himself let out a short, ugly laugh. A warrant? You're in no position to be serving warrants, boy. You're in a position to be buried. He gestured with his chin towards Alara's cabin. And what about your little jailhouse pet? The grieving widow with the loose morals. Once we're done with you, maybe my boys will pay her a visit. See if she's as generous with her comforts as she is with her cornbread. The insult was vile, designed to enrage Jedediah, to make him reckless. A red mist of fury clouded Jedediah's vision. His hand twitched over the butt of his Colt, but then he caught a flicker of movement from the corner of his eye. The door to Alara's cabin opened. She stepped out onto her small porch, her hand resting on the railing to steady herself. She didn't have a weapon. Her face was pale, but her expression was one of pure, unadulterated defiance. She stood there, pregnant and alone, and simply watched them, her gaze locking with Silas Croft's. Her courage was a silent rebuke, more powerful than any gunshot. It shamed Croft's crude words and exposed them for the cowardly bullying they were. She was not hiding. She was not afraid. She was standing with her sheriff. And then, something incredible happened. The door of the blacksmith's shop creaked open. Miller stepped out, a heavy shotgun held loosely in his arms. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, his jaw set. A moment later, on the other side of the street, Old Man Hemlock appeared in the doorway of his general store. He held an old buffalo rifle. He looked terrified, but he was there. One by one, doors opened. A farmer with a pitchfork. The stable owner with a horse pistol. Pastor Gable, his face grim, holding nothing but a large, leather-bound Bible, which seemed weapon enough. They were not an army. They were terrified shopkeepers and homesteaders. But they were standing, inspired by the quiet dignity of the jailbird sheriff and the unshakable courage of the pregnant widow. They had finally found the will to stand up for their own town. Silas Croft looked around, his arrogant smirk faltering. He had expected to face one man. He was now facing a community. His men shifted nervously in their saddles, their eyes darting from the sheriff to the armed citizens. The odds had changed. "This is your last chance, Croft," Jedediah's voice rang out, clear and cold. "Surrender your men and yourself to the law." Croft's face contorted in a mask of rage. He had lost control, and he knew it. In a final desperate act of malice, his hand darted for his pistol. He never cleared the leather. Jedediah's draw was a blur of motion, a single fluid act of lethal grace. The crack of his Colt echoed down the silent street. Silas Croft stiffened in his saddle, a look of shocked disbelief on his face. A small, dark hole appeared on his chest. He slumped forward, then toppled sideways, hitting the dust with a heavy, final thud. For a heartbeat, there was absolute silence. Then, two of Croft's most loyal men went for their own guns. Miller's shotgun roared, the blast tearing through the air. Hemlock's rifle fired a second later. One of the men screamed and fell from his horse, clutching a shattered shoulder. The other, seeing his odds, threw his gun into the dust and raised his hands high. The rest of Croft's men, leaderless and faced with a town that had found its spine, hesitated for only a second before following his example. Hands went up all along the line. The fight was over before it had truly begun. It was over. The threat that had choked Providence Gulch for so long was broken, lying dead in the dust. Jedediah stood for a moment, the smoke curling from the barrel of his gun, his chest heaving. The townsfolk slowly lowered their weapons, looking at each other with a dawning sense of disbelief and triumph. They had done it. They had taken their town back. Jedediah's gaze swept past the surrendered men, past the body of Silas Croft, past the stunned faces of the townspeople. His eyes found Alara, still standing on her porch. Their gazes met and held across the dusty street, a silent, profound communication that transcended the chaos. In her eyes, he saw not just relief, but pride. In his, she saw not just the hardened lawman, but the man whose life had been changed by a simple act of compassion. Slowly, he started walking toward her. The townspeople parted to let him pass, their expressions a mixture of awe and deep respect. He didn't stop until he was standing at the bottom of her porch steps. He looked up at her, the grim sheriff of Providence Gulch, his face streaked with dust and tension, and the weariness of the battle fell away, replaced by a raw, unguarded vulnerability. "It's over," he said, his voice quiet, meant only for her. She came down the steps to stand in front of him. Without a word, she reached out, and her fingers gently brushed a smudge of gunpowder from his cheek. It was a gesture of immense tenderness, an anchor in the swirl of adrenaline and relief. "I know," she whispered. He reached for her hand, his calloused fingers enveloping hers. It wasn't the tentative, fleeting touch through prison bars. It was a firm, solid connection, a promise, a beginning. He had fought for the town, but he had won for her. And in that moment, standing in the middle of the street with the town they had saved as their witness, they were no longer the prisoner and the widow. They were Jedediah and Ilara, two lonely souls who had found in each other an unexpected home. A week later, a quiet normalcy had settled over Providence Gulch, but it was a new kind of normal. It was a peace born not of fear, but of shared courage. Jedediah was the undisputed sheriff, and he wore the star with a quiet confidence that soothed the town's frayed nerves. He spent his evenings on Ilara's porch. Sometimes he would fix a loose board or mend a piece of fence. Other times, they would just sit together in her rocking chairs, watching the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. They didn't need many words. Their companionship had been forged in a crucible of danger and quiet understanding, and it ran deeper than conversation. Tonight, he was watching her as she hummed softly, mending one of his shirts by the light of the lamp. The needle moved with a steady, practiced rhythm. The swell of her belly was more pronounced now, a gentle curve that held the promise of a future neither of them had dared to imagine just a few weeks ago. He thought back to the dark, hopeless days in that stone cell, to the gnawing hunger and the suffocating despair. And then he remembered the first sight of her face at his window, the hesitant offering of warm cornbread. It was a kindness so unexpected, so pure, it had been a lifeline. It had reminded him that there was still goodness in the world, a reason to fight, a reason to hope. She looked up and caught him watching her, a question in her soft eyes. He smiled, that slow, genuine smile that was still reserved only for her. "Thank you, Ilara," he said. "For mending your shirt?" she asked, a teasing light in her gaze. "For the cornbread," he clarified, his voice thick with emotion. Her expression softened with understanding. She put the shirt aside and placed her hand on his. "You were hungry, Jedediah." He turned his hand over and laced his fingers through hers, holding on tight. He looked at her, then at the sheriff's star glinting on the empty chair beside him, and then back to the gentle rise and fall of her breathing. He knew then that his life had been saved not by the council's desperate gamble or by his own skill with a gun, but by this woman's simple, courageous heart. He had been a prisoner set for death, and she had been a widow preparing for a life of lonely hardship. Now, looking at the home they were quietly building together, he knew they had both been set free. The sun had set, and in the peaceful twilight, their new life was just beginning. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. This story showed love and heroism where least expected. What was your favorite moment of connection between them? Tell us in the comments.